He protected an enemy's child. Now the alien mother views him differently. Sergeant Ethan Hall crouched low in the mud, his pulse hammering in his ears. The once pristine landscape of the distant planet Arctos 7 had been turned into a battlefield, filled with craters and the remains of fallen soldiers from both sides. The sky above was clouded with the smoke of burning ships, and the roar of distant explosions echoed in the air. It was a sight all too familiar to Ethan: war. For years, he had fought in the intergalactic conflict between the Human Alliance and the Zurath Dominion, a ruthless alien empire that seemed bent on conquering every world they could reach. Ethan had seen too much death, too much destruction, and yet here he was again, charging into another battle without a second thought. His job was simple: sabotage the enemy's communications tower and disrupt their reinforcements. But as always, things rarely went as planned. Ethan's squad had infiltrated the Zurath stronghold under the cover of darkness, their goal clear. But the moment they breached the perimeter, everything fell apart. The Zurath were waiting, and they were ready. A firefight broke out. Blinding flashes of light and deafening gunfire filled the air. Ethan ducked behind a shattered wall, his rifle in hand, as his comrades returned fire, trying to hold their ground. It was then, amidst the chaos, that Ethan heard the sound that would change everything. A child's scream, high-pitched and full of terror, pierced through the cacophony of battle. For a moment, Ethan froze, his mind racing. A child? The Zurath had children. He had never seen one before, only the terrifying warriors who seemed to emerge from the shadows, always cold and merciless. Before he could process it further, the scream came again, more desperate this time. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He motioned to his squad leader to cover him and dashed toward the source of the sound, his boots splashing through the rain-drenched mud. He had no idea what he was about to find, but he couldn't just ignore the cry of a child in need. He rounded a corner of the building and skidded to a stop. There, in the midst of the wreckage, was a small figure, no older than 6, dressed in torn, dirt-streaked clothes. The child, a girl with wide, terrified eyes, was huddled beneath the twisted remains of a fallen Zurath vehicle. Her little hands clutched at the wreckage, her face streaked with tears. Without thinking, Ethan rushed toward her, dropping his rifle to the ground and kneeling beside the girl. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently, though he wasn't sure how he could make such a promise in the middle of a war zone. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't leave her there, not like this. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, her small body trembling. She was covered in dirt, her alien features unfamiliar to him. Her skin was a pale greenish hue, with strange markings that ran across her arms and face. Her long black hair was matted with blood and dirt, and her small, delicate features were twisted with terror. "SHH, it's okay," Ethan repeated softly, reaching out to gently lift her from the wreckage. The girl flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. She seemed exhausted, terrified, and lost. He stood up, holding her carefully in his arms. His mind raced as he glanced around. The battle was still raging, and his squad was nowhere in sight. He could hear the Zurath forces closing in, their footsteps heavy on the ground as they searched for their missing child. He had to act fast. With the girl in his arms, Ethan darted into the nearby building, his boots pounding against the cold, metal floors. The walls of the structure were still standing, though they were peppered with the marks of battle. Inside, it was dark, the only light coming from flickering overhead bulbs. Ethan found a narrow hallway and took refuge in a small room at the end. He quickly shut the door behind him, locking it as quietly as possible. The girl, still trembling, looked up at him, her big eyes filled with confusion. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Ethan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure how to answer that question. He had always been taught that the enemy was just that, the enemy. He was a soldier, and soldiers fought and killed to protect their own. But there was something about this girl that tugged at his heart. Maybe it was the innocence in her eyes, or maybe it was the fact that no child should have to live through a war like this. Regardless of the reason, he couldn't bring himself to leave her behind. I don't know," he muttered, "but you're safe for now." The girl didn't respond, but she clung to him tighter, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Ethan could feel her warmth against him, the weight of her small body reminding him of his own lost humanity. It was hard to believe that this child, this fragile being, was part of the same race that had been waging war against his people for so long. As Ethan crouched down to set her gently on the floor, he heard footsteps approaching. His heart skipped a beat. The Zurath were coming. They wouldn't stop until they found their child. And when they did, they wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who stood in their way. Ethan glanced around the room. There was no way out. His only option was to wait, pray that the Zurath would pass by, and hope that his squad would come for him soon. But as the footsteps grew louder, he knew that wasn't going to happen. The Zurath were closing in, and they were relentless. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the warrior standing before him. It was a Zurath soldier, tall, armored, and fierce-looking. The alien's red eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and the heavy blade in its hand was ready for battle. The soldier's gaze fell on the girl, and for a moment there was silence. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, the tension thick in the air. The Zurath didn't speak, but its eyes betrayed a hint of recognition. It knew exactly who the girl was. The soldier stepped forward, but before it could make a move, Ethan reacted. He lunged forward, tackling the Zurath to the ground. The two struggled, their bodies crashing against the floor with a loud thud. Ethan's hands went for the soldier's weapon, but the Zurath was strong, its claws digging into his skin as they fought for control. The girl, still sitting in the corner, watched in silent fear. She knew her mother's warriors would not stop until she was returned to her. But would they kill this human soldier for protecting her? Ethan gritted his teeth as the Zurath soldier pushed him back, its claws aiming for his throat. With one last surge of strength, he managed to wrench the alien's arm away and land a hard punch to its face. The soldier stumbled back, disoriented, and Ethan seized the opportunity to grab his rifle. With a sharp pull, the rifle's trigger squeezed under his finger. The shot rang out, piercing the silence, and the Zurath soldier collapsed to the ground. For a moment, Ethan stood over the fallen warrior, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He turned to the girl who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe." But in his heart, Ethan knew the battle was far from over. He had just made a decision that would change everything. He had protected an enemy's child, and in doing so, he had crossed a line that no soldier could easily uncross. Now, the consequences of his actions would follow him, no matter how far he ran. The war had only just begun. Ethan stood in the quiet room, the heavy silence pressing down on him. His rifle was now at his side, but his mind was elsewhere. The girl, Leah, was still sitting in the corner, clutching her knees to her chest. The look in her eyes haunted him. Fear, confusion, and a deep, profound loneliness that he couldn't quite place. For a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake. He had always been trained to fight, to follow orders without question. Soldiers didn't make decisions based on compassion. They followed the mission, completed the objective, and moved on. But protecting a child? That wasn't in the manual. The weight of the decision sat heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He had crossed a line by saving Leah, and now he had to face the consequences. The Zurath wouldn't let this go. They wouldn't care that he was just trying to do what was right. To them, he was a human soldier, an enemy, and they would stop at nothing to get their hands on him and their child back. A loud thud echoed from outside the room, followed by voices, Zurath voices, low and guttural. They were searching for her. Ethan's heart raced, his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. He glanced at Leah. She was trembling, her small body shaking in fear. There was nothing he could say to make this better. He couldn't promise her safety. Not now, not with the Zurath so close. He moved quickly, crossing the room to a narrow window. The view outside was nothing but destruction. Burned buildings, wreckage from the earlier battle, and the occasional flicker of Zurath patrols moving in the distance. Ethan's squad had been scattered, and there was no way of knowing where they were or if they could get to him in time. This wasn't part of the plan. He cursed under his breath, running his hand through his short hair. The military had always told him to rely on strategy and firepower, but those things didn't matter now. All that mattered was keeping Leah safe. He turned back to her, his voice softer now. "Stay here. Don't make a sound, all right." Leah looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. She nodded, but her lips trembled. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Ethan could see the terror in her eyes. It was a terror he understood all too well. Outside, the Zurath soldiers were getting closer. Ethan could hear their footsteps, the metallic clinking of their armor as they searched the surrounding area. He knew they would eventually find him. They wouldn't stop until they had their child back, and when they did, he would be the one to pay the price. He had to act. Now. Ethan quickly checked the small, makeshift barricade he'd set up at the door. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might buy him enough time to figure out what to do next. He grabbed his rifle and took a deep breath. The Zurath wouldn't expect a lone soldier to fight back. That was his advantage. He would use their overconfidence against them. The door rattled. Ethan's hand tightened on his weapon. The moment they came through, he would have to move fast. There was no room for mistakes. He glanced at Leah one more time. She was still sitting in the corner, her wide eyes locked on him. He could see the fear in her face, but also something else, a quiet trust. Maybe it was the way he had saved her. Maybe it was something deeper, something that connected them despite the chaos of their worlds colliding. The door crashed open. Ethan fired without thinking. The first Zurath soldier stumbled back, a blast of red energy bursting from his chest. The impact sent him crashing to the ground, but there were more. The others rushed in, their weapons drawn, their eyes filled with fury. Ethan fired again, the blast catching one soldier in the leg. He didn't fall, but the pain was enough to slow him down. Ethan didn't have time to waste. He ducked behind the barricade, taking cover as more shots whizzed by. The Zurath were relentless, but they were also predictable. They followed the same patterns, the same tactics. They didn't expect anyone to fight back, certainly not a human alone. But Ethan had learned to think quickly in combat, and he knew he had to keep them off balance. He picked off another soldier, aiming for the head this time. The blast rang out and the soldier collapsed lifeless. But the Zurath were closing in. Ethan could hear their voices, low, guttural commands. They were coordinating their attack, moving in to flank him. He had to move and fast, but there was a problem. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for Leah. He glanced over at her. She hadn't moved from the corner, but her eyes were wide with fear. She was watching him, waiting for him to do something, anything, to save them both. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. Ethan took a deep breath, then bolted from his position, charging toward the back exit of the room. The Zurath were momentarily thrown off, and in the brief moment of confusion, Ethan made his move. He dashed across the room, rolling into the hallway where another Zurath soldier awaited. But this one was faster. Before Ethan could react, the alien lunged at him with a knife. The blade sliced through the air, but Ethan was quicker. He grabbed the soldier's wrist, twisting it until he heard a sickening crack. The knife dropped from the Zurath's hand, and before the soldier could react, Ethan slammed him into the wall, knocking him unconscious. Panting, Ethan continued down the hallway, his mind racing. He had to find a way out. He had to find his squad. But first, he needed to get Leah to safety. He turned a corner and ran straight into a group of Zurath soldiers. They raised their weapons, but before they could fire, Ethan dove to the ground, rolling out of the way. He fired his rifle, hitting one soldier in the shoulder. The alien staggered back, but the others kept coming. Ethan's heart raced, his thoughts scattered. He couldn't fight them all. He needed a way to get to Leah to get her out of here before they were both captured or killed. And then he heard something, a voice. "Stop!" It was low, commanding. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He turned to see her standing at the end of the hall, the Zurath commander, Veshara. She was tall, with skin that shimmered in the low light, her eyes burning with a red fury. Her armor was sleek and intimidating, her every movement radiating power. She stared at Ethan, her eyes narrowing as she took in the situation. Her gaze flicked to the fallen soldiers around him, then to the weapon in his hand, and then finally to the direction where Leah was hiding. For a moment, everything stood still. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, his grip tightening on his rifle. Veshara's presence was like a weight pressing down on him. She was the leader of the Zurath forces. She was their most feared warrior, and she was now standing in front of him, waiting. "Release her," Veshara commanded. Her voice was cold, unyielding. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He couldn't let her take Leah, not after everything he had done to protect her. He had promised her safety, and he wasn't going to break that promise. "No," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his stomach. "I won't." Veshara's eyes narrowed, her hand resting on the hilt of her weapon. She didn't need to say anything more. The battle was far from over. The hallway seemed endless as Ethan kept moving, each step heavier than the last. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the weight of the rifle in his hands felt like a burden he was no longer sure he could carry. Every moment, he expected to hear the sharp crack of a shot, the searing pain of a blaster wound, but the silence stretched out instead. He could feel the pressure mounting, the walls of his mind closing in. Ahead of him, the shadow of Veshara loomed like a nightmare come to life. She was the leader of the Zurath, a warrior forged in the fires of conflict, and in that moment she stood between Ethan and the one thing he cared about more than anything else, the child he had vowed to protect. Leah. The weight of his decision pressed down on him again, but there was no time to second guess. The only thing that mattered now was getting to her, getting out of this hellhole alive, and finding a way to get to safety. Ethan rounded another corner and found himself in a larger room, an empty storage area filled with crates and debris. It was a perfect hiding spot, a moment of relief in the chaos. He slid into the shadows, his heart still racing. His eyes quickly scanned the area, looking for a place to lay low for a while, but there was no time to rest. The Zurath were close, too close. He didn't hear the footsteps, but he felt their presence. The Zurath were fast, relentless, and ruthless. Veshara was the worst of them all, calculating, cold, and unyielding. She would never stop hunting him. She would never stop until she had Leah back. Ethan's mind raced. How could he protect her? How could he keep her safe from the soldiers who would stop at nothing to tear them apart? What would Veshara do to him if she caught him? The question lingered in the back of his mind, but he didn't have the luxury of worrying about it. He had to focus on the present. Leah was still hiding in the small room, just a few floors above. He had told her to stay quiet, to stay hidden. He couldn't afford to put her in any more danger than she already was. She had already seen too much, witnessed the bloodshed, heard the cries of war, and yet, through it all, she remained as silent as the night. A child shouldn't have to witness this kind of violence. She shouldn't have to live in a world where war was a constant, unyielding force. But that was the world they lived in. Ethan pushed the thought away and steadied himself. His fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle as he slipped from the shadows and crept toward the door. He couldn't stay in the storage room forever. He needed to get back to Leah. He needed to. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed open. Ethan spun around just in time to see the flash of red eyes, the unmistakable gaze of a Zurath soldier. The soldier was quick, faster than Ethan had expected, and before he could raise his rifle, the alien lunged, knocking him to the ground. The Zurath was on top of him now, pinning him to the cold floor. Ethan struggled, trying to free himself, but the soldier was strong, its claws digging into his shoulders as it slammed him back down. His rifle was just out of reach, the barrel pointing uselessly at the ceiling. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, panic rising in his throat. He couldn't fight like this. He couldn't lose now, not when he was so close. In a desperate move, Ethan brought his knee up, driving it into the soldier's stomach with all his remaining strength. The soldier grunted, its grip loosening for just a moment. That was all Ethan needed. He twisted his body, throwing the soldier off him. With a quick roll, he grabbed his rifle and fired a shot directly into the alien's chest. The soldier crumpled to the ground, motionless. Ethan didn't take a moment to celebrate his victory. He didn't have the luxury. He knew there were more soldiers coming. There always were. He ran down the hall, his pulse thundering in his ears. He didn't dare look back. Every footstep behind him could be the last one he took. Every turn he made could lead to a dead end. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to keep moving. He had to get back to Leah. The corridors were quiet now. The sound of his boots echoed in the empty hallways, but no more soldiers appeared. He couldn't tell if that was a blessing or a curse. The longer he was out in the open, the more vulnerable he became. The Zurath were masters of ambush. If he wasn't careful, he'd walk right into their trap. But as he reached the staircase leading up to the room where Leah was hiding, he heard something that froze his blood, Leah's voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. She wasn't supposed to make a sound. She wasn't supposed to. He sprinted up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. He rounded the corner at the top and saw her, standing in the middle of the room, her tiny figure silhouetted against the harsh lights of the corridor outside. And standing in front of her, blocking her escape, was Veshara. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan's mind went blank. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only see Leah, the child he had promised to protect, and Veshara, the leader of the Zurath forces, standing between them. Leah's eyes were wide with fear, her small body trembling as she looked at her mother. Veshara's cold, unblinking gaze was fixed on the girl, but there was something else there, Something that wasn't anger or rage, but something softer, something more dangerous. Vishara's lips parted slightly, but her voice was controlled, calm. "Leah," she said, her tone almost tender. "Come to me." Leah took a hesitant step forward, but stopped, her tiny hands shaking by her sides. Mom?" Vishara's eyes softened ever so slightly, but there was still that cold edge to her voice. "You are safe now, come with me." Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He had to act. He had no choice. But how could he fight a mother trying to take her child? How could he stand in the way of a reunion, especially one that was filled with so much complexity? His thoughts raced, but his decision was clear. He couldn't let this happen, not like this. He had already made the choice to protect Leah, and that meant standing up to whatever force came between them. "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice a low growl as he stepped into the room, his rifle raised. "She's not going anywhere with you." Vishara turned slowly, her red eyes locking onto his with a gaze that sent a chill down his spine. She was a warrior, a leader, but in that moment, Ethan saw something in her that he hadn't expected: doubt. It was brief, just a flicker in her eyes, but it was there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan could feel the weight of his decision in every muscle of his body, could feel the stakes of this confrontation pressing on him. Vishara's lips curved upward ever so slightly, but her voice was icy. "You would stand in my way for a child? You would defy me?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I would," he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've already taken everything else. I'm not giving her up." For a long moment, Vishara said nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lowered her weapon, her gaze lingering on Ethan for just a second longer before she turned toward Leah. But there was no fight. Not yet. Ethan knew, deep down, that this was far from over. But for now, they were both alive. And that in this war was all that mattered. The air in the room was thick with tension. Ethan stood between Leah and Vishara, his rifle lowered but still in hand. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat heavy with the weight of his choice. On one side, Vishara, the commander of the Zurath forces, the one he had been trained to fear and destroy. On the other, Leah, the child he had promised to protect, who had become more than just a mission. She had become a symbol of everything he had been fighting for, a future where innocence could be saved, a future where war didn't claim the lives of everyone it touched. Leah stood beside him, her small form trembling, her eyes wide with fear as she watched her mother. Her gaze flicked back and forth between Ethan and Vishara as if trying to make sense of the situation. Her lips quivered, but she remained silent, unsure of what to do. Vishara's red eyes locked onto Ethan, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Ethan knew that the Zurath commander had the power to destroy him with a single gesture, but there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty, something he had never seen before. "You would die for this child?" Vishara's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it held a dangerous edge. "Do you truly believe she is worth it, worth all of this?" Ethan didn't hesitate. He didn't even have to think about it. "Yes," he said firmly, his voice steady. "She's worth it. She deserves a life away from this war." Vishara's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze flickering to Leah, who had taken a small step forward. "She is my daughter," Vishara said, her voice filled with something close to sorrow. "I've done what I must for her. She belongs with me." Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. He could hear the emotion in Vishara's voice, the conflict there. She wasn't just a cold-hearted leader, a ruthless warrior. She was a mother. That much was clear now. But it didn't change what she was asking. She wanted to take Leah back into the heart of the Zurath war machine. She wanted to raise her to be just another soldier, another tool in their endless war. Ethan wouldn't let that happen. "Maybe she belongs with you," Ethan said, taking a step forward, "but she doesn't belong in this war. She deserves to grow up in a world that's not defined by bloodshed." Vishara's expression hardened. "You know nothing of our world, human. You know nothing of what it means to protect your people." "I know what it means to protect someone you care about," Ethan said, his voice rising, "and right now that's Leah. She doesn't need to follow your orders or be part of this endless conflict. She needs to be free." Vishara's eyes flicked to Leah again. For a brief moment, the two stood locked in an unspoken conversation, a mother and her daughter, separated by the ravages of war. Ethan could see the hesitation in Vishara's posture, the way her shoulders tensed, her breath shallow as she seemed to battle with something inside herself. The moment didn't last long. Vishara's voice cut through the air, firm and unwavering. You are a fool if you think I will just let her go. Ethan's heart sank, but he didn't back down. I'm not asking you to let her go. I'm asking you to let her live. Let her have a chance at something better. For a long while, there was no response. The silence between them was deafening. The sound of distant explosions from the battle outside was the only thing that reminded them of the larger conflict still raging across the planet. But in that room, for just a moment, it was just the three of them, Ethan, Leah, and Veshara. Two warriors, one with a rifle, the other with a heart full of questions, and a child caught in the middle of a war that she hadn't asked for. Finally, Veshara spoke again, her voice colder than before. You think you can change her, human? You think your presence here, your words, will be enough to erase everything I've done for her? I don't think I can change her, Ethan replied quietly, his voice softer now. But I can protect her. I can give her a chance to choose her own path. Veshara's gaze hardened again, and she took a step forward. Ethan didn't move, but his grip on his rifle tightened. He wasn't going to shoot. He wasn't going to fight her unless he absolutely had to. But he knew that if it came down to it, he would do whatever it took to keep Leah safe. Veshara stopped just in front of him, her towering figure looking down at him with a mixture of contempt and something else, something that might have been respect or maybe pity. You have no idea what you're up against, she said, her voice dangerously calm. You think you can stop this war? You think you can change the course of history with one act of kindness? You're nothing, just a soldier who got lucky. Ethan stared at her, meeting her gaze head-on. Maybe, he said quietly. But I've seen enough destruction. I've seen enough lives torn apart. I don't care what history says. All I care about is protecting the people I care about. And right now, that's Leah. Veshara's eyes flickered for a moment, and Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something else, something close to sadness. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the cold, calculating mask she had worn for so long. Leah is my responsibility, Veshara said, her voice sharp once more. I will not let you take her from me. Ethan felt a weight settle in his chest, a heaviness that he couldn't shake. This wasn't just about the war anymore. This wasn't just about the Zurath or humanity. It was about two people who were bound by something far deeper than either of them could understand. It was about a mother who wanted to protect her child, even if that meant sacrificing everything. And it was about a soldier who had seen too much pain and wanted nothing more than to stop the cycle of destruction. He had already made up his mind. He had already chosen his side. I'm not trying to take her from you, Ethan said, his voice calm now, steady. I'm just trying to give her a chance to choose. Veshara stared at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, and Ethan could feel the weight of her gaze, the intensity of the moment hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. And then, without warning, Veshara turned away, her back to him. You have no idea what you're asking, she said quietly, almost to herself. No idea at all. Ethan watched her, his heart heavy with uncertainty. Was this a victory, or was it just a temporary reprieve? Leah stepped forward, her tiny form standing between Ethan and her mother. Mom, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to fight anymore. Veshara froze, her back still turned to them. Leah, she said, her voice trembling for the first time. You don't understand. Yes, I do, Leah said, her voice gaining strength. I understand that we don't have to keep fighting. I understand that I don't want to be part of this anymore. I just want to be free. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had heard what Veshara had said, and he could see the way her whole body stiffened. For the first time, he saw the cracks in the armor of the Zurath commander. She was a mother, too, and she was faced with the one thing she had never expected, her daughter choosing a path that didn't include her. Veshara's shoulders slumped, and she turned to face her daughter. For a moment, the two stood in silence, looking at each other. The world outside seemed to fade away as they shared this fragile moment, a mother and daughter at a crossroads, torn between loyalty and love. Finally, Veshara spoke, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Then go, Leah, go with him. But know this war will not stop. It will continue whether you are with me or not. Leah nodded, her eyes still wide but filled with a sense of relief. She stepped closer to Ethan, reaching for his hand. I don't want the war, Mom, I just want to live. And for the first time, Veshara didn't stop her. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. But for the first time since everything had started, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Leah was standing beside him, her small hand grasping his tightly, her face a mixture of fear and relief. Veshara, the powerful commander of the Zurath forces, stood just a few steps away, her expression unreadable as she looked at her daughter. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them, Ethan, Leah, and Veshara, but for the first time the room was quiet. No weapons were raised, no voices shouted. It was as if, for just a moment, time had stopped, allowing each of them to take a breath. Ethan looked at Leah, the girl who had changed everything. He had started this journey as a soldier with a clear mission, to fight, to win, to protect humanity. But now, standing here in this strange alien world, he realized that it wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about her. It had always been about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The war, the violence, it all seemed distant now. The most important thing in this moment was to give Leah the chance at a future she could choose, a future free of the destruction and hatred that had defined her world for so long. Veshara's gaze flicked between them, her expression hardening once more. For a long time she didn't say anything. The silence between them stretched on, filled with an unspoken understanding. She was a mother, too. Ethan could see it now. Her armor had been a barrier, but behind it she was just as human as anyone else. She had fought for her people just as he had fought for his, but she had never truly considered the cost of that fight. Now, with her daughter standing before her, the truth was unavoidable. "You don't understand," Veshara said finally, her voice quiet but laced with pain. She turned away from them, pacing a few steps, her back to Ethan and Leah. "The Zurath are a dying race. We don't have the luxury of choosing peace. We fight to survive." Ethan's heart twisted. He had heard the stories, the reasons the Zurath fought. They were a race born of conflict, a species that had never known peace, constantly struggling to hold on to their place in the universe. But it wasn't enough to justify the endless cycle of violence. Nothing could ever justify that. "We're all fighting to survive," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "The difference is you're choosing to fight against people who want peace too. You're choosing to tear apart lives to hold on to a way of life that isn't working anymore." Veshara stopped in her tracks. She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing as if she were considering his words for the first time. "And what do you propose?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That we all stop fighting, that we just forgive and forget. Do you think that's how this works?" "No," Ethan replied, shaking his head. "But maybe it starts with one person. Maybe it starts with one choice. You don't have to keep fighting. You don't have to keep this war going. There's another way." Veshara's shoulders tensed and her jaw clenched. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between the leader she had been raised to be and the mother who stood before him now, wanting something more for her daughter. She looked at Leah, and for the first time, Ethan saw something soft in her gaze, a flicker of doubt. Leah, who had been silent up until now, spoke in a small, tentative voice. "Mom, I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to hurt people." The words hung in the air, a simple statement that carried the weight of a lifetime of struggle. Veshara turned slowly, her eyes flicking between Ethan and Leah, as if weighing the enormity of what her daughter was saying. For a moment, Veshara was still, her eyes never leaving Leah's face. Ethan could see her shaking, the emotions she had kept buried for so long bubbling to the surface. The war, the loss, the years of fighting, they had all brought her to this point. And now, with Leah standing there, her innocence and hope laid bare, Veshara was forced to confront everything she had been fighting for. "I never wanted you to have to fight," Veshara said, her voice cracking slightly. "But that's all I knew. That's all I could offer you. I thought I was protecting you by making you strong, but now I see." Her words trailed off and she fell silent again. Leah stepped forward, her tiny hand reaching out to her mother. "I don't want to be strong like that, Mom. I just want to be safe. I want to live." The words pierced through the cold armor of Veshara's resolve, and for the first time, Ethan saw something other than cold determination in her eyes. There was guilt, there was sadness, and there was a deep, aching love for the child she had always tried to protect, even if her way of doing so had been misguided. Veshara looked down at Leah, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch her daughter's cheek. For a long time, the two stood there, facing each other, the distance between them filled with years of fear and pain. Then, with a deep, resigned sigh, Veshara lowered her hand. "Go," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't have to be part of this anymore. Go with him, Leah. Find a life, find a future." Tears welled up in Leah's eyes, but she nodded. She didn't speak, but Ethan could see the relief flooding through her, the hope shining in her face for the first time. She had made a choice, and her mother, in the end, had let her make it. Ethan moved toward Leah, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He glanced at Veshara one last time, unsure of what to say. There were no easy words for this. No way to undo the years of war and violence that had shaped them all. But in this moment, there was a glimmer of something else. Hope. A possibility for something better for both the Zurath and humanity. It might not come soon, but it could come. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly to Veshara, his voice full of sincerity. "You've given her a chance. Don't forget that." Veshara didn't respond. Instead, she turned her back on them, her eyes closing for a brief moment as if she were gathering herself. She didn't speak, but in her silence, Ethan sensed something unspoken passing between them, a moment of understanding. It wasn't a victory, it wasn't an end to the war, but it was a start. Leah reached for Ethan's hand, and together they turned to leave the room. As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but glance over his shoulder once more. Veshara stood in the same spot, her shoulders slumped, but there was a change in her, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. As they stepped into the hallway, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The war wasn't over. The Zurath weren't going to stop fighting just because one mother had let her daughter go. But this, what had just happened, was a crack in the wall. A chink in the armor, and it was enough to give Ethan hope that someday, somehow, things could change. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. They had taken a step towards something better, something real, and maybe that was all they could do. "Come on," Ethan said, looking down at Leah, whose face was now filled with a quiet determination. "Let's get out of here." Together, they walked down the hall, leaving behind the past and stepping into a future where anything was possible.